Good morning. I call this hearing to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. I want to thank everyone, especially our witnesses, for joining us today for our committee's hybrid hearing. I want to make sure to note some important requirements. Let me begin by saying that standing House and committee rules and practice will continue to apply during hybrid proceedings. All members are reminded that they are expected to adhere to these standing rules, including decorum. During the covered period, as designated by the Speaker, the committee will operate in accordance with House Resolution 965 and the subsequent guidance from the Rules Committee in a manner that respects the rights of all members to participate. House regulations require members to be visible through a video connection throughout the proceeding, so please keep your cameras on. Also, if you have to participate in another proceeding, please exit this one and log back in later. In the event a member encounters technical issues that prevent them from being recognized from the questioning, I will move to the next available member of the same party and will recognize that member at the next appropriate time slot, provided they have returned to the proceeding. In the event a witness loses connectivity during testimony or questioning, I will preserve their time as staff address the technical issue. I may need to recess the proceedings to provide time for the witness to reconnect. And finally, remember to remain muted until you are recognized to minimize background noise. Over the last few months, the outbreak of COVID-19 has led to an unprecedented public health crisis and creating a dire economic crisis for small firms. 3 out of 4 businesses are experiencing a decrease in revenue since March, and over half of small businesses are concerned about being forced to close. Small businesses across the food supply chain system have been impacted. As social distancing and stay-at-home orders became commonplace, the closing of commercial kitchens put restaurants and workers at the front lines of the pandemic, and the ripple effects hurt small firms across the food production, processing, distribution, and retail chains. Companies that process and deliver food to commercial businesses face abrupt order cancellations across their entire customer base. Farmers who planted crops and tended livestock for months based on pre-pandemic demands and markets were unable to find processors to sell their products. Fishing boats stayed in port, processors were backlogged and stopped bringing in materials. Grocery stores struggled to maintain inventory as consumers rushed to buy food for at-home consumption. Many of the issues facing our food system and society existed pre-pandemic. Now, because of the inability to control the spread of the virus, they are made worse. Our nation's food banks were already under pressure, but are now where millions of unemployed Americans turn to feed their families. Sweeping consolidation has led us with far fewer small farms, processors, distributors, and retailers. Large multinational corporations have received millions in federal support while small businesses continue to struggle to survive. Essential farm and food system workers on the front lines, many of whom are immigrants and people of color, still lack basic worker protections despite experiencing high rates of coronavirus cases. Congress, especially members of this committee, have worked to secure funds to help America's small businesses survive this crisis. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program and Paycheck Protection Program has helped millions of small businesses and farmers to stay afloat. Along the way, we have tried to improve those programs, ensuring that minority business owners and rural business owners who often do not have relationships with national banks were being served by the PPP program, and amending the IRA program so that small American farm businesses could access the program. But more needs to be done, and that is why we are here today. Yes, the PPP program greatly assisted 5 million businesses, but there are approximately 30 million small businesses in the U.S., and they continue to face an uncertain future. In fact, the SBA reports that in May 2020, employment in leisure, hospitality, and food service was down 41% compared to May 2019. We're still hearing reports of more and more farmers facing bankruptcy. This pandemic is further highlighting an economy that was not working for everyone. Prior to the pandemic, 40% of Americans didn't have $400 in the bank for an emergency, and more than 20% of households experienced food insecurity. In the past 6 months, as millions of Americans are unemployed, Amazon, Facebook, Target, and Walmart stock prices are near all-time highs. This is a tale of two economies, one that is working for Wall Street, while Main Street businesses are left behind. Many small businesses across the food system are still in the difficult position of figuring out how to pay rent and survive, while many have shut down forever. As we work to help assist the American people and America's small businesses, I look forward to hearing from our panelists today about how Congress can address the ongoing challenges facing our food system and how we can further assist in the recovery. Again, I want to thank the panelists for joining us here today, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since March, our nation's way of life has been disrupted due to COVID-19. America's food system has been hit particularly hard. Our favorite restaurants were closed, meat options were low at grocery stores, and many essentials were sold out. Today's hearing will provide much needed context to these experiences because if we better understand the why, we can better prepare for the future. Our nation's food system is typically geared to meet commercial demand, restaurants, buffets, and cafeterias, for example, more than retail demand, grocery stores. When our food demand flipped from eating out to cooking at home, businesses along the supply chain had to pivot to survive. Unfortunately, the system didn't adjust quickly enough to repackage and distribute fresh produce, milk, and meat originally prepared for commercial use. We have all made dramatic changes to our everyday lives. Producers along the food supply chain have quickly adopted new direct-to-customer business models. New strategies and services such as online retail or local delivery require significant investments of time and money. Recently, I had the opportunity to spend some time in Waynesville, back home in my district, to meet with small business owners impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. One business owner, Lacey Sims, the owner of Village Family Restaurant, spoke with me about how she utilized the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP program, to keep her 25 workers employed so she could continue to serve the community. And most importantly, those folks who worked for her could continue to support their families. She has quickly adapted her business to accommodate pickup, delivery, and indoor dining. At this committee, we understand the power of our nation's innovative spirit. Now, the rest of the country can see it firsthand. Investments being made by small businesses across the supply chain are creating a more resilient food system for all of us. I want to thank each of our witnesses who will be sharing their experiences and for being part of our national recovery. Madam Chair, thanks for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. I would like to take a moment to explain how this hearing will proceed. Each witness will have 5 minutes to provide a statement, and each committee member will have 5 minutes for questions. Please ensure that your microphone is on when you begin speaking and that you return to mute when finished. With that, I would like to thank our witnesses for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. Our first witness is Ms. Kimberly Gorton, the president and CEO of Slade Gorton Company. She is the third generation Slade Gorton, a manufacturer and primary distributor of fresh and frozen seafoods products. Our second witness is Mr. Jimmy Wright, the president of Wright's Market, a family-owned independent grocery store that has been innovated in online and mobile shopping. Our third witness is Mr. Rob LaRue, the president of National Farmers Union, which represents family farmers and ranchers across the country. Finally, I would like to turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Shabbat, to introduce our last witness.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Colin Castor is co-founder of Seventh Son Brewing, which opened in April of 2013, and its sister brewery, Antiques on High, which opened in November of 2018. He developed a passion for American craft beer, especially Ohio craft beer, while working in restaurants and bars across Columbus. For the past 6 years, Mr. Castor has served as the president of the Ohio Craft Brewers Association, which represents more than 300 craft breweries across the state. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Castor during the Brewers Association virtual hill climb in July. I want to thank him for taking time away from his business to be with us here in DC today. It's nice to see him, and we definitely appreciate it, especially being here in person. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat, and thank you all for being here. I now like to begin by recognizing Ms. Gorton for 5 minutes. Ms. Gordon, you might need to unmute. She's not on. So, Ms. Gordon apparently is having some technical difficulties, so we are going to recognize Mr. Wright for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Velasquez, Ranking Member Shabbat, and committee members. I am Jimmy Wright, the owner of Wright's Market, an independent grocery store located in Opelika, Alabama. It is an honor to share my experience as a single-store food retailer serving on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm testifying on behalf of the National Grocers Association, the trade association representing the independent supermarket industry. Wright's Market is a family-owned business that started as a small convenience store in 1973 and evolved to a 22,000 square foot full-service grocery store. Independent grocers like me are deeply rooted in the communities we serve. Our Mayor, Gary Fuller, has allowed me the opportunity to join you virtually from City Hall, a testament to the strong support we receive from our community leaders. To say 2020 has been a challenging year would be an understatement. Since mid-March, independent grocers have experienced sustained and historic levels of demand for grocery and household products. We have had to adapt to large volumes of customers stocking up on weeks' worth of food, straining the supply of key product categories like paper, cleaning, supplies, and shelf-stable products. 7 months into the pandemic, the supply chain continues to cope with major product shortages. Throughout the pandemic, we've dealt with significant operational challenges to keep up with demand while working to provide the best environment for customers and employees, including adapting enhanced cleaning measures and using protective equipment. It hasn't been easy. I like to say independent grocers are flying a plane and building it at the same time. But I want to pause and say thank you to all of our dedicated employees who know the importance of our work to the community. We call them our supermarket superheroes. Although independents are resilient in overcoming operational challenges, we've seen the competitive playing field tilted against us towards our largest competitors in the pandemic in several ways. The first is due to economic discrimination. Inconsistent distribution and apparent shortages of high demand products is not just a symptom of the current crisis, it's a direct result of a lack of antitrust enforcement and the dominance of power buyers in the marketplace. Dominant retailers use their size and scale to impose discriminatory conditions on manufacturers and suppliers in a way that disadvantages smaller independents, which impedes our ability to compete. For decades, independent grocers haven't had access to pricing, promotions, and packaging deals that provided to larger firms. Since March, these problems have worsened as power buyers use their market power to demand prioritization to distribution of high demand products. I've lost access to both popular products and promotional pricing, as I've watched my big box competitors continue to sell all products unavailable to me. This has made us much less attractive to customers seeking one-stop shopping in the pandemic. The effect of buyer power is not only felt by small grocers, but it harms consumers that live in rural areas serviced by independents. We need strong enforcement of U.S. antitrust laws to ensure our ability to compete for the benefit of all Americans. The second competitive issue is our limited ability to sell products to SNAP customers online. The pandemic has accelerated e-commerce, a trend we saw coming. Wright's Market launched our e-commerce service, Right to You, in 2016. We were fortunate to have been selected for the USDA SNAP online purchasing pilot, which allows customers to use their benefits online, and launched in March, just days before National Emergency Declaration. Unfortunately, the technical barriers and cost of participating in SNAP online make it difficult for small retailers, and must also work through an extensive application and testing process. My store remains the only single store operator to launch. Meanwhile, Amazon and Walmart have expanded their SNAP Online program almost nationwide. Independents need a quicker approval process, less technical barriers, and lower implementation costs to compete. A level playing field is critical to preserving a thriving and vibrant independent grocery sector. I appreciate your attention to my concerns. Thank you for the privilege to testify today. I look forward to discussing your.
Thank you, Mr. Bright. And now we recognize Ms. Gordon for 5 minutes. Ms. Gordon, you need to unmute.
Thank you, Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Shabat, and distinguished members of the Small Business Committee. I am President and CEO of Slade Gorton and Company. I am pleased to have the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss how the seafood supply chain has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Slade Gorton is a third-generation family business based in Boston. We are one of America's largest seafood processors and distributors and are proud of our record of supplying hundreds of millions of healthy and safe seafood meals to American families for over 90 years. More than 1.7 million Americans work in the U.S. seafood industry, 500,000 of whom work in the middle of the supply chain, many for small family-run companies like mine. Without us, the fisherman's bounty would never make it off the docks. We are the vital link that gets seafood from our oceans to your tables. Over 2/3 of our industry's $150 billion in annual sales come from restaurants and other food service establishments, such as university dining halls, hospital cafeterias, and cruise ships. With capacity limits in place at many restaurants and the closure of many other public eating venues, seafood companies all across the supply chain are at serious risk of failing. This has left our industry in uncharted waters. We have had to deal not only with billions in lost sales, but also with the job losses that go with such an unexpected downturn. My company alone lost over 70% of its business in the immediate weeks following the nationwide shutdown. Many struggling companies rushed to freeze and store products. Some even began selling directly to consumers. Even with that effort, millions of dollars worth of fresh product that could not be sold or stored had to be destroyed. And when restaurants moved to curbside pickup and delivery service, seafood did not get its fair share. Fish simply doesn't travel as well as other meal options. Even with partial reopenings, restaurant operators are faced with increased costs at a time when many are operating at below break-even capacity. All have had to find ways to simplify service and menus and cut food costs. So it is only through ingenuity, resilience, grit, and determination that companies like Slade Gorton have been able to survive thus far. One of the biggest issues currently affecting the seafood supply chain is related to the large unpaid debts owed to distributors for food that restaurants could not sell during the mandated shutdown. Now that food service establishments are open and working to reopen, they will need to rely on their suppliers to continue to provide credit so they can restock their kitchens. We are now faced with choosing to extend further credit at some risk or abandoning what are in many cases decades-long customer relationships. My company has chosen to stick by our customers because without them, we have no future. We estimate that the seafood industry has about $2.2 billion in outstanding bad debt, in addition to the estimated $10 billion of bad debt for the larger food service community. This is not something that can be absorbed by small business. We need help to fix this. While my company was fortunate enough to receive a PPP loan, which has certainly helped us to rehire furloughed employees and keep them on board thus far, I'm afraid these funds will not be enough to sustain small businesses through what is a much longer economic recovery than we imagined early on. If we are going to help the economy get back on track, we need to help small businesses survive this pandemic. Current figures suggest that 25% of all restaurants in the United States have closed forever. It is imperative that Congress pass another stimulus bill to include expanding the scope of expenditures that qualify for forgiveness. Allowing restaurants to use funds to pay off their current debt so they can afford to purchase new food and supplies and rehire staff will go a long way toward preventing additional business failures. Additionally, restaurants, retailers, and all businesses along the seafood value chain are now faced with increased costs associated with frequent sanitizing, new employee training regimens, retrofitting processing lines, retail spaces, and restaurant dining rooms, and providing PPE for employees. These increased yet necessary operational costs are prohibitive as we struggle to adapt. I urge Congress to consider federal grants or tax credits to help pay for these critical safety measures. Ultimately, jumpstarting the economy requires continued support for those businesses who drive 80% of our GDP, small businesses. The seafood supply chain is a complex one, but one that helps ensure every American has access to this healthy and sustainable protein. We need our government to recognize the seafood community as the broad and diverse system we are. I implore you to act now in support of small business, seafood businesses, and our industry's lifeblood, restaurants. Food is the foundation of health and well-being and is at the center of happiness, human connection, and a vibrant nation. Our families have fed your families for generations. Our families now need you. Thank you for allowing me to discuss the impact COVID-19.
Thank you, Ms. Gordon. And now we recognize Mr. LaRue for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Shabbat, and members of the committee. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As mentioned, I am Rob LaRue, and I serve as president of the National Farmers Union. We work to ensure that farm families and their communities are respected, valued, and enjoy economic prosperity and social justice. Thank you for addressing the challenges that farmers and the food system face during this time of crisis in public health, in the economy, and in our society. In recent decades, our members have been hard hit by corporate consolidation among companies who sell inputs to farmers and among companies who purchase what farmers produce. This mounting market concentration has been compounded by low crop prices, a global trade war, and increasingly frequent severe weather events. Since 2012, annual net returns for farmers have trended downward for major row crops due to rising production costs and declining prices for commodities. As the pandemic took hold, consumer demand shifted dramatically with the closure of restaurants, schools, and other institutions. Processing facilities, particularly in the meat sector, were shut down due to outbreaks among workers. At least 370 meatpacking plants, or 1/3 of the national total, experienced COVID-19 outbreaks as of last week. There were nearly 43,000 cases in the meatpacking sector alone. Supply chains were interrupted and many farmers suffered financial struggles while the price of food for consumers increased. The U.S. Department of Agriculture Prices Received by Farmers Index showed a 6% decrease from April through July 2020 as compared to the same period in 2019. Farmers' losses have not been passed on to consumers, who instead are paying more for food. So far in 2020, the Consumer Price Index for food is 3% higher than 2019. As supply chains adjusted to new consumer demand patterns and processing facilities have largely reopened, problems linger for the farm and food system. The price of corn has been severely affected by falling demand for ethanol, as 43% of corn grown in the U.S. is used for biofuel production. Stay-at-home orders kept Americans off the road, and fuel consumption dropped sharply, costing the ethanol industry $10 billion in sales. To make matters worse, EPA's broad allowance of small refinery exemptions and an unwillingness to permit higher blends of ethanol have further eroded corn prices. While the disruptions caused by the pandemic are unprecedented, many of the problems we face are nothing new. The pandemic revealed the fragility underneath our food and farm system. As farmers, we are optimists and urge policymakers to apply lessons learned this year to address the long-term issues. In order to be more resilient, we need to build a robust regional food infrastructure. A good start would be stronger antitrust enforcement from federal agencies like the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Farmers and ranchers need more choices for marketing their crops and livestock. To do this, we need to spur development of small and mid-sized processing plants. In the meat industry, an important step in that direction would be the Ramp-Up Act, which is included in the recently revised HEROES Act. Earlier this year, this committee helped farm businesses gain access to Small Business Administration programs. A lingering barrier to access PPP is the requirement to show positive net income, because more than half of farms have negative income in recent years. NFU supports H.R. 7175, the Paycheck Protection for Producers Act, which would allow farmers with net negative income in 2019 to qualify for the program using gross income instead. Lastly, pandemic aid efforts have helped farmers withstand the current crisis, but future efforts should focus on policy changes to address the causes rather than simply the symptoms. of a broken farm economy. One way to do this is through a cost-effective supply management system for farm commodities that would balance production with consumer demand. Thank you for this opportunity to address the committee, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. LaRue. And now we recognize Mr. Castor for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Shabbat, and members of the committee, thank you for your statements to begin this, and thank you for asking me here to testify today. My name is Colin Castor, and I am founder of Seventh Son Brewing Company in Antiques on High, located in Columbus, Ohio. I also serve as board president of the Ohio Craft Brewers Association, representing 351 breweries in the Buckeye State. Seventh Son has been producing beers since 2013. In the past 7 years, we have watched our business grow to 2 locations, around $5 million in sales, and around 70 employees. I've always been proud of the fact that for every new job created in beer, there are 24 jobs generated in the industries that help us to brew and sell our beer. Unfortunately, this goes both ways. According to a recent report by the economic firm John Dunham & Associates, 651,000 jobs supported by the U.S. beer industry will be lost by the end of the year due to COVID-19. Prior to the coronavirus changing our world, Seventh Son sold our beer through tap rooms, restaurants, bars, and retailers throughout Ohio. The uncertainty over the past 6 months has made it extremely difficult to continue to run this business. Summer is the busiest time for most breweries, and in Ohio, we're limited to around 40% of our normal capacity and have had a 10 p.m. curfew imposed since May on alcohol sales. Some states have guidelines that have actually made it impossible to operate on-premise tasting rooms, and many would welcome federal guidance and consistency to help with these issues. The majority of breweries in the United States make the majority of their revenue from tap rooms and tasting room sales. Estimates by the Brewers Association suggest that small brewers have seen on-premise sales revenues go down 30% since March. Most breweries get their wholesale revenue from on-premise sales to restaurants, bars, and concert venues, which have been severely restricted over the past 6 months. These outlets sold nearly 20% of the total U.S. beer volume annually. Their closures resulted in an estimated $900 million worth of beer that will need to be destroyed. Data from September shows draft sales still around a third lower than this point last year. At Seventh Son, we have our own canning line and some existing relationships that helped us to absorb most of this on-premise volume loss. On March 16th, we began a home delivery business and carry-out sales model out of our shuttered tap rooms. These measures were a lifeline, but our head is very much still barely above water. We completed a $5 million expansion in 2018 and have a wonderful facility, but also the debt to go with it. When we sell a can of beer to our distributor, we get $5 less than when we sell that same can of beer out of our tap room. We built our expansion for future wholesale growth, but tap room revenue is absolutely essential to support it. I'm sure you've seen the headlines referencing increased alcohol sales. Those increases must be offset against the massive decline in sales at on-premise channels. The size of the overall pie has not shifted, even as the individual slices appear different. Even with those increases that we've seen in off-premise, the brewing industry is expected to lose $22 billion in 2020. In addition, the increased demand for cans, both in and outside of our industry, has caused an aluminum can shortage in the U.S. Another issue that we have seen during the pandemic is that many ethanol plants that captured commercial CO2 were taken offline. Though production partially has ramped back up, our industry still sees signs of a shortage caused by natural disasters and unexpected closures. For our industry to survive, breweries need certainty, and we need financial assistance. Please pass the bipartisan Craft Beverage Modernization Tax Reform Act and make the current federal excise tax rates permanent. If the current tax rates expire, my federal excise tax rates will go up 100% starting in January. This would cost me $25,000, which essentially cost me an employee. We appreciate Congress's swift action at the beginning of the pandemic with the CARES Act. It resulted in thousands of breweries receiving money from the Payroll Protection Program. I would very likely not be here had it not been for the $359,000 that we received. The program wasn't perfect, but we can ensure its success by forgiving all of the PPP loans of less than $150,000 to small business, adding additional funds to this program, and allowing businesses that can show revenue losses to apply for another loan. Give us the ability to write off the funds that were used as business expenses as well. And allow 501c6s like the Ohio Craft Brew Association, the ability to apply for PPP loans. Our guild has helped us more than double the number of breweries in Ohio in the past 5 years, helping to create more than 21,000 jobs. In conclusion, I feel strongly that Seventh Son needs another round of PPP to survive the impacts of COVID-19, but please also consider passing the Restaurants Act and Restart Act, both of which would provide small breweries with grants rather than debt and allow us more flexibility in how we use those funds. We also encourage Congress to consider a credit for unmerchantable goods that had to be destroyed due to supply chain interruptions caused by the virus. For the past decade, the United States brewing industry has been a success story in American manufacturing and job creation. We need your help to weather this pandemic and continue to grow and thrive. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Castor, and we appreciate all you have shared with us. Let me begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes, and I would like to start off with my first question to Mr. Wright. The census just reported that 1 in 10 adults do not have enough food to eat, and 27% of households with children are food insecure. As we strive to ensure that hungry people have access to food during this pandemic, why are there so few small retailers approved by the administration for online SNAP purchases?
We appreciate the opportunity to be included in that pilot. I think there are several things that make that a challenge for the smaller retailers. Certainly one is the technical aspect of navigating that to be able to get set up from a small retailer standpoint, their costs with setting the system up, their cost to processing part of that, overall assistance that are needed from a retailer to understand the program. We have already experienced in our launch, and we launched in 1 week before the pandemic buying started. We recognized in our launch already that there is an education process we need to go through to be able to inform the customers of how to use the program. We would advocate for the SNAP Online Options Act, I believe it's HR 7535, be able to own our retailers to expand online options. In our own area, what we look at is the ability to deliver to rural areas around us. So it's a technical process to work through, an application process to work through. We were very fortunate.
Okay, Mr. Wright, time is
Yes.
running out, and I need to ask all the questions. Thank you so much for your answer. Mr. LaRue, I recently introduced the Mobilizing Restaurants in America Act so that SNAP recipients can gain access to food and while also supporting struggling restaurants. How important is updating and funding SNAP and other nutrition programs like the Double Up Box program to farmers, farm workers, and small businesses across rural America?
Oh, it's absolutely essential, and we appreciate your leadership in this area. SNAP remains the most efficient way to address food insecurity out there. So as we look at ways to further bring resilience in that delivery, we've certainly seen a lot of hiccups with the pandemic, ways to pivot, if you will, to make sure that SNAP and ultimately good quality food is available from farmers and connect that to consumers, including and especially those in food insecurity. So it is vital, and all of the programs along with that, you mentioned the Double Up Box, et cetera, and USDA programs to connect farmers to those consumers, all of those issues are critically important.
Thank you. Ms. Gordon, restaurants and small firms across the supply chain are continuing to struggle, and that has resulted in issues for food processors and distributors. PPP assisted many in your industry, including yourself. What other steps do you recommend that Congress take and the Small Business Administration so that we could address the challenges that you're still facing? Ms. Gordon, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chairwoman. So I think there are several things that we would ask respectfully that Congress does. I think first and foremost that USDA must allow food purchase in their programs. Thus far, seafood has not been included in all of their programs. It's an important protein, it's a health, and we would have to be included in seafood. I think also introduced in the new bill, it allows for suppliers and
Ms. Gordon, we are having difficulty in listening, hearing what you're saying. So I would appreciate that maybe you could submit an answer to the committee on that question.
Certainly. Certainly.
Thank you. Mr. LaRue, Mr. Wright, since the outbreak of the pandemic, stores around the country have struggled to stay stocked with in-demand products. What role has increased corporate consolidation and market control played in your ability to source and sell products?
You've seen an increase in the larger players being able to access products that we are not able to get, especially some of the key products such as comfort food items such as pasta and rice and beans and some of those things, paper products, cleaning supplies. All those things have been very difficult for us to source due to such power from the larger retailers. I can walk in those stores and see those products on the shelf that I am not able to source.
And do you feel that there is any role or impact that corporate consolidation and market control has to do with that?
Yes, ma'am. Again, as the retailers consolidation continues on the retail side, we continue to see larger big box retailers have more and more power in being able to put pressure on all the manufacturers that they will get product.
Okay.
And to the point of actually penalizing some of these suppliers if they do not get the fill rate that they're looking for. And again, that's taking product away from the smaller retailers.
Thank you. My
independent
time.
grocers.
Thank you. My time has expired, and now we recognize the ranking member, Mr. Schaub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Castor, I'll begin with you. You had mentioned that it's much more profitable in the tap room than what you sell. You make per unit a lot more there, obviously. And then you mentioned that the 10 p.m. curfew that we have in Ohio, that you have to cut off at 10 p.m. has had a pretty dramatic impact on your sales. My district is, we're down the bottom of the state. You're Columbus, I think, and I'm Cincinnati. So we have Kentucky right across the Ohio River there. And so the 10 o'clock, what we've heard that's been on the news and written about, and I know the businesses are feeling this, you know, they can just leave Ohio and go over to Kentucky and take their business over there. How have you been affected up in Columbus on the 10 p.m. curfew, and do you have any recommendations on that, perhaps? Not that we can do that here, but the states obviously make that on a state-by-state basis, that determination.
Sure. My own experience with the curfew, it's definitely hurting our sales, definitely not helping our sales. We don't have Kentucky across the river, but we do have Ohio State University, and we're a relatively large city, 1.5 million people. So what we're seeing is people go out until 10 p.m., and then they just go to house parties, gatherings where they might not be socially distanced, whereas at responsible restaurants and bars across Ohio, we're actually practicing social distancing, passing out masks, doing all these things. And ironically, I feel like people are a lot safer going out sometimes than going to these more like private gatherings.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Ms. Gordon, I'm going to go to you next. Although I think you and I purchased our Wi-Fi at the same place, because when we're at my home doing these things, I've had that breaking up a lot apparently, but I'm going to try it. You indicated that you lost over 70% of your business in the weeks following the nationwide shutdowns. How did you adjust your business operations to try to survive during that time?
Thank you. I'm hopeful you can hear me now. Well, as with many businesses, the first week is really about survival and about slowing down the flow of goods in our supply chain. As many other companies, we had to freeze some of our fresh product. We had to put product in cold storage. Currently now backing up, and focus on maintaining cash flow. We worked very closely with our customers to make sure that we could continue to support in that still operational. We worked very closely with our suppliers to be able to extend. And first and foremost, our primary focus was keeping our employees safe. And that really required in our plants making sure that we implemented additional measures. We've invested in new technology. We've invested in a tremendous amount of PPE and in training to make sure that our workers are safe. We could continue to process seafood. Very fortunate, and that we have had no disruption in our own operations during this. I do understand, though, that a number of other seafood processors disruption in their business. I think particularly some of the processors in Alaska who rely on a tremendous amount of seasonal workers. We're having a lot of workers and put them up in hotels for 14 days prior to.
Thank you.
Obviously,
Thank you. I'm going to try to get one more question in my time. I've got a little over a minute to go. So, Mr. Wright, I'll go to you next. How have you adjusted your inventory as we continue to deal with the coronavirus restrictions? Has that changed over time? How have you handled that to try to stay maybe not profitable, but to survive?
From the supply side, we've just had to expand on items that we could source, and our suppliers have had to look for sources we traditionally would not, be buying product from. In my own case, we actually end up with all the toilet paper shortages that were there. We actually end up sourcing some toilet paper from a factory in Mexico in order to be able to have some product to sell. We've, a lot of the brands and major selling items we cannot get back to the large power buyers. But if there's a regional item or something, we were able to. The big issue with us was fresh meat. That was the one that really was critical to us because such a large portion of our business. And again, that's evident consolidation in that industry and the challenges that were made on the supply side when the pandemic hit and so many of those places closed.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, my time's expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Now we recognize the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Finkenauer, Chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Rural Development, Agriculture, Trade, and Entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today. Obviously, this is a huge issue that we're still dealing with in the middle of this pandemic, and it's something that is hit close to home in my district in particular. So my question is to Mr. LaRue. So in Iowa, workers in my state and in my district lost their lives as a result of COVID-19 outbreaks in large meat processing plants. Not only, obviously, was this devastating for the communities and the families where these processors are among the biggest employers, it created disastrous consequences for our food supply chain, especially for our livestock and poultry producers. I recently actually co-sponsored something you talked about, the Ramp Up Act, which would obviously create more competition into the processing sector. So how do you think, and can you expand upon this, these types of investments in our small plants could help us prevent some of the issues we saw with worker safety and then depopulation in Iowa?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an important issue that you bring up because really what we're talking about here is taking ourselves from what is a very concentrated, arguably a very efficient system, but one that really has no resilience built into it. And the Ramp Up Act that you mentioned is an important step in shifting ourselves from a very concentrated marketplace to one that is much more local and regional based. Building in more systems for options for producers helps take a lot of the stress out. it also would ensure a much more focus on worker safety and so forth. So again, taking ourselves away from a very efficient-driven system that is so concentrated and has so many workers all at once into something that is creates much more opportunity for rural communities, I think is a huge step forward.
Great, and I obviously agree, but I want to also touch even further here on the issue of competition. I've heard real issues with price transparency from our cattlemen, and also helped introduce legislation to require packers to buy at least half their slaughter on the spot market. Thinking back to the high prices, obviously, of beef and what we've seen during this pandemic, at least in the grocery stores, but doesn't always come back to our producers. How could more transparency help our cattlemen, and make our supply chain more resilient?
You touch on another key piece of this, right? Not only do we have a huge concentration, we have four beef companies controlling over 80% of the beef market. We have just 50 meat plants out there that manage 98% of the processing. It's incredible concentration. But the other piece of this is that we don't have a true cash market price out there. And so for these small business owners, these independent family farmers and ranchers, they have no way to truly understand where the market is. There are a slew of lawsuits going on right now related to price manipulation in the meat industry. And I think this is another key component of that. So measures such as the one that you referenced and that our members are actively advocating for up on Capitol Hill would be an important piece of reestablishing a true operating market. And certainly a key piece of that is price discovery. And so more information will be better.
Well, thank you, Mr. LaRue. And I know, obviously these issues have always been important, right? But now going through this pandemic, and I've seen this now through many different issues, whether it's access to broadband and needs for that. Going through a pandemic, these issues are really heightened and underscored in a number of ways. And these are just things we've got to get right, and we've got to get right fast, because especially when it comes to our supply chain, when it comes to making sure our agricultural community is not something we just cannot take it for granted. Really grateful for your expertise, and thank you for your testimony today as well.
Thank you.
And with that, I yield back, Chair.
The gentle lady yields back, and now we recognize Mr. Balderson from Ohio, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Innovation and Workforce Development, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Castor, thank you for being here. I'm one of the three representatives, along with Congressman Stivers and Congresswoman Beatty, that represent Central Ohio, so it's great to see you here, and I know your establishment, so thank you. In your testimony, you mentioned three major efforts Congress needs to undertake in order to help small business brewers such as yourself. These three issues being passage of H.R. 1175, the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act, specific adjustments to PPP and other SBA loan programs, and a tax credit for perishable goods that had to be destroyed due to supply chain disruptions. As a co-sponsor of H.R. 1175, the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act, I am hopeful we can pass this bill and provide you with this tax relief. I would like to ask you about your comment about a tax credit for perishable goods. How did your business account for the loss of perishable goods prior to COVID?
Thank you. Prior to COVID, we did not have a lot of loss from perishable goods. We would, of course, we've made a lot of different styles of beer. Every now and again, something wouldn't work quite right. It's still a commodity. It's a perishable good in general, but we didn't run into the kind of volume and the kind of circumstance that precipitated just having to immediately cut off sales. And then in our case, we were able to repackage some as cans, but we still just dumped beer. I've never seen anything like it. And it's not just us. It's restaurants dumping beer. It's wholesalers dumping beer. It's the actual breweries dumping beer. But this is a good, when people mistreat beer and put it in their car or something, like, think of it like milk. It actually has an expiration date. It goes bad. and a lot of beer went bad.
I agree. I talked to a couple friends of mine in my home county that also do the same thing and talked about that. I would like to ask you about your comment about a tax credit for perishable. How would this tax credit differ from existing practice?
I would probably not be the best person to comment on the mechanics of it, but it seems more like this was a one-time circumstance. This was a once-in-a-lifetime kind of experience that we've been through. So some type of tax credit, some type of structure, not a permanent structure like the craft beverage modernization. We'd like that to be permanent. In terms of practice, we'd just like this to be a one-time, help us out with what we had to dump.
Agree. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
My next question is for Mr. Wright. I would be interested to hear your perspective on this matter. How did your independent grocery store account for food loss prior to the virus?
Prior to the virus, we work very hard every day to control the amount of waste and shrink that we have. We certainly, anything that we have that we can donate to food banks and such as that, we do those things. So we just try to manage that supply chain very well and make sure we offer the freshest product and do not have a tremendous amount of loss that we end up having to pass on to the and through our pricing somewhere.
Thank you. Would you be able to quantify the financial cost your business has had to incur because of disruptions in the food supply chain?
For us, it was a lot of overtime. Certainly as business ramped up, we had a tremendous amount of overtime for our employees. We did some additional bonuses. The investments that we made in plexiglass dividers at the registers, PPE equipment, and all of those things. Also, for us, it was a loss of margin in a lot of places as we tried our very best not to raise prices. And this goes back to the situation with meat. We held our prices down as low as we possibly could to cover our cost and be able to try to give the customer the best price they could, even though things had went up. We made very, very little margin on some of those items. So, we had loss of margin, increased expense in operating the store, and investments also in the equipment and facility to be able to provide a safe shopping environment for the customer.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to get this in. I might run out of time, so I'll cut you off. But finally, I introduced legislation to provide small businesses with up to $25,000 in tax credits for the purchase and replacement of PPE. How significantly would this help your business? And I am sorry, sir, but we are out of time. We'll follow up with you on that. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentle lady, Ms. Davis, from Kansas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you to you and Ranking Member Shabbat for holding this hearing today. And I'm really glad we're focusing on the massive impact we've seen from the pandemic, the devastating impact really on our food system and especially on our restaurants. And one of the things I get to do as the 3rd District representative is talk up Kansas and the Kansas City metro area. For folks who don't know, you can't talk about our KC region without talking about barbecue. And, this is everything from Joe's KC to Jones Barbecue and Slaps and so many others that are really not just part of the culture of the place, but are huge economic drivers, and they're often small businesses. And we know restaurants across the country are facing enormous challenges, and we've seen so many inspiring examples of folks who are stepping up and doing everything they can. I've been proud to be a co-sponsor of the Restaurants Act, which would create a new grant program for the restaurant industry. And right now, we are seeing the far-reaching impacts, and that's on the restaurants and the suppliers. So, Ms. Gordon, I wanted to ask you first, if you could, in your testimony, you had mentioned the difficult situation that you're facing as a supplier of some of your as your customers try to reopen and need additional credit. Could you talk a little bit about on that position that you're in, that your customers are in, and how you've been addressing it?
Yes, I'm going to try to speak on my phone. Hopefully this is more clear. We're having a bad storm here in Boston. I think it's affecting us. I think it's really just a matter of we've had to extend credit terms, and the way we've worked it with our customers is that they are, as they've ramped back up, they are now paying us for the products that they're buying now. And what we are working with them on is to put in place payment plans for them to help pay us back for the product that they purchased just prior to the shutdown. In some cases, that's working well. In other cases, it's not. I think that if Congress is not able to pass more relief and a stimulus for restaurants in particular, as the original PPP funds run out, we're going to start to see a lot more failures, which will have a domino effect on companies in the food industry and specifically the seafood industry. I think, as I mentioned, 70% of seafood is consumed outside the home. And so in that restaurants fail, we as an industry have a disproportionate effect to other industries.
Yeah, and so you started to get into legislation that we've passed. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about how we as legislators can ensure that supply chains are supporting restaurants are also supported during this time?
That restaurants are supported. Well, I think that the legislation
and the suppliers.
And the suppliers. Well, I think one of the key things that you could do is to ensure that the PPP funds that are available can be used for covering bad debt. That would go a long way towards helping people in our supply chain. Right now, the funds are primarily used to keep people employed and to pay utility and rent costs. However, our biggest challenges come from the risk that we have associated with bad debt. So if the PPP funds could be extended to include restaurants' ability to use those funds to pay off their bad debt, that would certainly help companies like mine immeasurably.
Thank you. And thanks for taking the time to testify here today. I was hoping to switch gears really quickly. Mr. Wright and Mr. LaRue, I wanted to know if you have some ideas about improving food assistance programs during this time. I know, I'm sure you all, after seeing everything, have some thoughts on that.
In my case, just continuing to have a strong SNAP program would be a key to that. Also, being able for independents to offer online SNAP would be a tremendous asset for the customers that either cannot get to the store or choose not to come to the store during the pandemic. So a strong SNAP program and ability to go online for everyone and be able to offer that. Right now, only Amazon and Walmart are able to offer that. Myself and one other operator, a regional operator in New York, New Jersey. So we would appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that.
And I would simply echo those thoughts. And from the farmer perspective, we need strong access to the SNAP and food assistance. It's critically important for all of us.
Thank you, and thank you for your time. And I yield back.
Gentle ladies, time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Tax, and Capital Access, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Shabbat, and our witnesses for testifying today. As many of you know, I've been a small business owner in the restaurant industry for over 35 years. As a franchisee for the McDonald's Corporation, I've built up an extensive knowledge of supply chain operations. Through this experience, I've learned that restaurants rely heavily on their supply chain operations, where success is extremely dependent on the efficiency of their wholesalers, distributors, and food supply. Unfortunately, as our witnesses have duly noted in their written testimonies, COVID-19 has taken a severe toll on each of these services. Even with the SBA and USDA's government assistance programs, farmers and food suppliers were still facing excess supply issues where many of their perishable products were going to waste. On this committee, my colleagues often hear me discuss my business experiences with restaurants, but what many may not know is that one of my first ventures was farming. I built and ran a successful hog farming operation and also formerly worked on numerous poultry farms for Tyson Foods. Because of my background within numerous aspects of the supply chain, ranging from the farm to the storefront, I can attest to the obstacles our witnesses have brought forward. As one of our witnesses mentioned in their testimony, farmers are having to dump out our produce, euthanize their livestock, which has devastating impacts on their bottom lines. These types of issues also have trickle effect. When farmers struggle, our wholesalers, distributors, restaurants, and small businesses struggle. This burden is then passed on to the American consumer, who might run into the issues of accessing the food supply and certainly will have an impact on their pricing. Going forward, Congress must ensure that we take the appropriate actions to support the food supply system and thereby provide for our local communities during this unprecedented time. As many of you know, at the brink of COVID-19, Congress worked swiftly to pass emergency relief legislation. One of those provisions of this relief expanded unemployment insurance, giving people the ability to draw unemployment and receive an additional $600 per week. While well-intentioned, this policy created undue burdens for many businesses deemed essential. These payments were not adjusted for cost of living, which caused employees to refrain from working, as some made more from government benefits than they did their actual job. Mr. Wright, you touched on this issue in your written testimony. Could you please elaborate on the issues you faced regarding staffing?
Certainly, in the first wave of pandemic buying, we had 2 weeks that were the largest volume weeks that we've ever had, and also, I think, across the industry. As we began to reach out into the communities and looking for additional employees, that was a challenge. We were very fortunate in our area to have some college students and some that were essentially stuck at school with the classes being canceled. They came in and kind of saved us, so to speak. But if we reached through our traditional channels, we didn't have very little success on finding people. Certainly, I agree with your remarks, Congressman, that there was an incentive, as a lot of people were making more off of unemployment they were working. Also agree that there's some kind of cost of living analysis or metric put into that to adjust that. That has changed now for us the last few weeks. I just on Saturday this week, I reached out through social media with an ad for employees very quickly. At the end of the day, had 16 applicants. So it was a challenge in the beginning, but we're seeing improvement on the backside. A real struggle on the supply side for people loading trucks and the warehouse workers and all retailers across the
Thank you, Mr. Wright. I want to move on to another question. There's been a lot talking about lines of credit, grant program, forgiveness of loans. As many of you are very familiar because you've addressed this, alluded to it, on the floor we have an opportunity to vote on H.R. 8265 that the ranking member has put forward for us to try to get on the floor for helping our small businesses survive. It's $138 billion of money left over from the PPP program. Just a simple yes or no. I'll start with you, Mr. Wright. Would you support that if you had the opportunity? Would you encourage your congressman or congresswoman to support that? It's an extension of the $138 billion, very targeted, 25% down in sales, and also would go through the end of the year. Would you have your congressman support that? Yes or no?
Certainly would want to assist all small businesses out there. You know, we have seen a dramatic impact in our communities.
So, Mr. Wright, I'm going to take that as a yes. I've got 10 seconds left. I want to get to Ms. Gordon.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Ms.
Yes. Hi, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? We're having a bad storm here.
No, I'm sorry. I don't have time there. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Sorry.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Gordon, there is a good business in Philadelphia that is similar to yours, Samuel Sons Seafood Company, which is a seafood supplier to hotels, restaurants, and casinos. Like yours, its business dropped 75% in the span of a few weeks, leaving it with unused products and debt that would not be affordable. With nearly 2/3 of fish being consumed outside of the home, how many in business like yours adapt to this environment? What assistance do you need from Congress to help your business adapt?
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And yes, Samuels and Sons is a very well-run company. They are a customer of ours. What needs to happen to make sure that we get the support, we needed a few things. First, that Congress includes processors and distributors within the scope of any relief that you provide. And agencies, also as USDA, would do likewise in formulating relief programs for the food industry. Second is despite the fact that you have allocated $300 million to the seafood industry through NOAA, they have been very slow to get the money to the intended recipients. Congress passed the CARES Act at the end of March. It took till May for NOAA to even announce how they would distribute the funds. And funds are still trickling in. We expect to not maybe even be able to receive them until the end of the year. And then finally, I think that additional funds being allotted to the seafood industry in the next stimulus act, if you could establish a firm deadline for NOAA to do that and insist that the agency meet those deadlines for any additional funds, that would go a long way towards helping processors and distributors like Samuels and Sons and my company.
Mr. Wright, I was pleased to see that you mentioned the bill that I co-authored with G.T. Thompson, the Chain Act, which will provide payment relief for frontline food workers. During this pandemic, food workers have been deemed essential, yet many of them have not been getting the essential worker wages they deserve. Tell me why you support this bill.
Certainly our employees that have stuck in there and assisted our customers and ran our stores during the pandemic. We have great respect for it. Again, we refer to them as supermarket superheroes. Anything that we can do to reward those people for that commitment to our communities, to our customers, in the most important part of our economy, which is the food chain, especially during this difficult time, would be greatly appreciated. I think it will be a great act, and I appreciate your leadership on that.
Last question, Mr. Lauren. Mr. Lauren, Philadelphia has over 24% poverty, which means that a significant portion of the city residents experience food security. Programs like the Farmer Food Box are instrumental in fighting hunger. You mentioned in your testimony that this program has been riddled with many problems. What can Congress do to fix these problems to make the program more effective?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's an important issue, right? Being able to connect those growers of good quality food, like your Pennsylvania farmers, to consumers and making those connections. The program that USDA developed, I think, had good intentions. I think a big piece of this, though, is making better connections to those smaller scale both distributors and farmers. I think that building those stronger connections, which USDA currently doesn't have, will be one step. But also recognizing, as we've stated before here, is recognizing the efficiency and benefit of SNAP itself and ways to continue to improve not just with this program, but also SNAP and other ways to continue to build these connections to those who are food insecure. It's an important issue. Thank you.
I yield back to balance my time.
The gentleman yields back, and now we recognize Mr. Bishop, gentleman from North Carolina, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And one thing about being so low on the seniority totem pole is that sometimes a lot of ground's been covered by the time it gets to me. So I'd like to focus on just one topic, I think. And Mr. Castor, I'd like to address a question to you. I was minded in your exchange with Mr. Alderson and your testimony that or reminded of a fellow named Spiro Kaltsunis, who runs a great little family restaurant in Monroe, North Carolina called Hilltop. And he told me shortly after he was required by order of the governor of North Carolina to shut down, that he had a dead loss of $75,000 of perishable goods in his inventory. And you made reference to that in your exchange with Mr. Alderson and in your testimony. And these are one of these losses. It's a working capital loss that is irreplaceable for very small businesses in a lot of cases. And wouldn't you agree that fixing that through the Paycheck Protection Program or a grant or something is critical to lots of small businesses being able to survive?
Thank you, sir. Yes, I would agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment, and I think a couple of the other witnesses have kind of touched on it. We made PPP work. We fit within the hours, the employee restrictions and everything, but having more flexibility, if there's another round of PPP to cover some of those things, additional grant funds, it's absolutely critical. We are small to medium size. There are so many in Ohio that are smaller than us that can't take that $75,000 loss that's closing down.
And following that up, and I don't know if it was touched on by Mr. Hearn, but there's he said 138 billion. I think the number is actually $133 billion of money already appropriated into the Paycheck Protection Program, which is basically expired. Ranking Member Shabbat has a bill that would just amend that to allow folks, companies, all sorts of very small businesses who can document a very significant revenue loss to get another round of that. And they're forgivable loans, again, like the first ones were, so sort of like a grant. Do you think, and so I think there's overwhelming support in the House for that. There's a discharge petition pending for people to sign it to get it out, and yet leadership is blocking it from a vote because we had disagreements on illegal immigration and how many trillions need to go to state and local governments. Do you think the American people are as mystified as I am? Why the House leadership won't allow that one point of agreement to go ahead and go forward so people can make use of, small businesses can make use of that $138 billion of money already appropriated, while we otherwise solve these other big problems later?
You know, I think that it's getting increasingly hard to, I can hardly think of anyone except maybe barring my wife, who I agree with the politics entirely on in the world. And it is, I'm dumbfounded a lot that we can't focus more on the things that we do agree on and the things that we do need to do, and this falls into that category. I understand how politics gets attached to everything, but this is just small business. These are just people who need help. This is exactly why government is supposed to be here, is to reach out and get us through this. We need you guys, and it's one of those things that the less we can get all these other issues conflated with it, and the more we can just say, breweries need you, restaurants need you, small business needs you. Let's get something through. We can even fix it. We can add to it later, but let's help out in some way, because I think a lot of us won't be around if it takes too much longer.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Castor. I think as somebody who's new up here, I don't understand it either. And interesting, we've got one more opportunity this week before we're gone for October to fix that one little problem and make an enormous difference in the lives of all these small businesses out there that are struggling to survive and all the employees who depend on them. With that, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Shabbat, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Castor, what would you prefer, debt financing or more grants?
I would prefer all of the above, actually. In terms of how I think debt financing works for some people in some situations, I think that grants obviously work for some people in most every situation. Right. But we need dollars, we need options, and we need the... Because
in the CARES Act that we passed back in May, is sitting in the Senate side, that includes grants. And the reforms to make those loans more, to provide more access to those businesses that were left behind, that didn't have an opportunity to access those loans in the first and second tranche that we passed. So it's a matter of fairness that is not included in the ranking member's legislation, but is included in the CARES Act, in the HEROES Act, plus the new bill that we just introduced this week. And now we recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I want to, in particular, thank the witnesses today for sharing your story. You represent the millions of small businesses across our country who are struggling in this crisis. The pandemic has affected every aspect of your business, their business, and in no small part, the impact on our supply chains has been devastating. And I also want to thank the committee and always the committee staff for working through the challenges to allow us to have this hearing to talk about this important issue. Later today, the House is going to be voting on a bill I introduced, a bipartisan piece of legislation. Again, the example of us coming together, working together. It's called the COVID Prepare Act. The idea behind the bill is fairly straightforward. As we face the pandemic, as we have struggled, and so many small businesses have struggled through the spring and the summer, just scraping by to make ends meet, we need to know that all aspects of our federal government have a plan for the expected rise in cases and new challenges we will face in the fall and into the winter. So the COVID Prepare Act would require each agency to present to Congress their plan so the American people will have transparency and confidence that their government is working on their behalf. As our witnesses can attest, a critical aspect of this is supply chain, and every stakeholder within the food supply chain in particular has had to adapt to the new reality. Like all small businesses, they've had to be nimble and figure out how to make a square peg fit into a round hole by switching from indoor dining to a focus on carryout, shifting from a delivery model as direct to consumer, or the myriad other ways that they relied on their own creativity simply to stay afloat. But these small businesses and millions of others around the country should not have to be on their own, standing alone. And that is what has been so deeply frustrating about this pandemic, the federal government not stepping up to this challenge to provide industries with the necessary guidance for safely operating in this pandemic and finding a way through to the other side. We all know that small businesses will need additional financial assistance. As we just talked about a moment ago, the question of whether it is loans or grants is an important question. Businesses are already on the edge of financial ruin. Many are closing their doors permanently. That's why the assistance we're providing in the HEROES Act is so important, and the revamped version of that bill introduced this week has to come to the floor for a vote and ultimately go to the Senate. But we also know that we need guidance to get through and operate safely in this new environment. So let me start with you, Mr. LaRue, if that's okay. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for all you do on behalf of our country as a farmers. One of my colleagues earlier mentioned their experience working on a farm. I worked on a chicken farm as well. I know how hard it is from a day-to-day basis, but more importantly, I understand the complexities of trying to get product to market on a consistent basis. As you highlighted in your testimony, with meat packing facilities, certain parts of the food supply chain were particularly impacted by COVID-19 because they could either not or would not enact social distancing measures. And if they could, it had a severe impact on capacity. Looking forward to the fall and the winter, what guidance can federal government provide from USDA, OSHA, and other federal agencies that would help agricultural producers maintain capacity while incorporating the best practices in social distancing?
Thank you, and thank you for the question there. One of the first things I think that bears repeating here is the need to build more resilience into the system, which I think will be beneficial to from the farm level, actually through the food chain itself, and particularly for farm workers and for those food workers who have been severely impacted. So building that resilience involves a couple of things. First of all, it's trying to remove some of the level of concentration that is currently there, which involves antitrust enforcement. It is also supporting the ability for small and very small processing plants right now to be able to get their inspection to a level that they have more markets available. Currently, it's cost prohibitive for those small and very small plants to be able to meet a level of inspection that allows them to ship interstate. And so supporting measures like the Ramp Up Act is one of those pieces there. The more that we can build resilience by taking the amount of workers that we have, I think, as I mentioned earlier, 50 meat processing plants process 98% of the meat in this country. That's not good for farmers, not good ultimately for the food chain and its resilience, and ultimately for our food security. So from farmer and consumer point of view, it's all about building that resilience.
Thank you. And I'm out of time, but let me just say with one last concluding thought, I know how hard it is for you as business owners, business leaders, but also the employees in your businesses. These essential workers are showing up to work every day. We are so grateful for them, for all you do, for all they do. Thank you. And we'll work to make sure we get the relief necessary to move forward. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. I appreciate y'all being here and appreciate the panel very much. I see one person up there, Mr. Wright, who probably doesn't speak with an accent. I think I saw where he was from Alabama, so I might just call on him if that's all right. I'm from Tennessee, so we can say that. The rest of them are snickering, but I guess they get it pretty quick. How long did it take you to obtain your PPE?
I think it took probably less than 4 weeks for us to get that. We were very fortunate in the fact of having a medium-sized bank that still has local leadership in it that kind of held our hand through that. So I think it was maybe 3 to 4 weeks at the most.
Okay. You're quoted in your testimony as saying that you doubled the rate of pay for our employees early in the pandemic and provided bonuses and overtime pay as the pandemic wore on. Have your employees returned to their pre-pandemic wages?
What we did on that is that we paid an extra week of pay for the first month and the second month, and then we transferred that over to a percentage of their pay. Everyone has returned to the same level of pay, continue to put some stuff out there time to time, but I chose to go the bonus route with that extra week of pay.
Right, okay. Has the $600 per pay and unemployment compensation affected your store's workforce?
Early on, we saw the challenges with that as we tried to reach out. And again, we were fortunate to find some college students from Auburn that we were able to employ on a short-term basis. That has improved now in the last few weeks, reaching out. So initially, it was an issue.
Great. Mr. LaRue, let me ask you a question. Can you walk us through a farmer's decision-making process when faced with supply chain shocks?
Yeah, well, that's a massive question, but which can vary greatly. And I might just reference the reason why it's complicated, right? It's pretty obvious in the sense that if you are a hog producer and you're raising a set of animals up, they are being timed to be ready for market at a certain weight to be processed. And when those challenges happened, that's where you saw processing plants being shut down and therefore forcing producers to make very difficult choices, in many cases needing to euthanize those animals. If we're talking about beef, for those independent ranchers out there, beyond the complexities of trying to determine what the market price truly is, they also struggled with these beef plant closures. For them, they can put animals either on feed or on pasture for a little bit longer, but those take those animals out of condition, if you will, and means that their ultimate price that they're going to get is much lower, and obviously their input costs are higher. If you are storing grain, that's a very different matter, but the grain markets pretty much across the board have been severely low for many, many years. So for all of these farmers who have been operating on very low margins, these disruptions along the supply chains have just been really devastating and really kind of compounded the economic challenges that they already had.
I've found in Tennessee the meat processors, used to call them slaughterhouses, but I guess that's not politically correct. But the meat processors, it's hard to find one, and when you do, you have to schedule, and they're scheduling out months in advance, and that's just not a way to do business. And and I don't know if it's by design or not, but during this whole thing, I've noticed that the big boys are systematically going to crush the little people, and I've found also that over half of our meat processors in this country are foreign owned, and that to me is a scary proposition. It is very scary, and thank you for that. I don't know how much time do I have. 41 seconds, so I'll have to go quick. Mr. Castor, I don't know if I'm saying that right or not. Why does a brewery make more money from taproom sales than sales through distributors?
First and foremost, it's the cost of the packaging. The packages that we put our beer into cost more, as much, if not more, than the liquid itself. Each can runs about 20 cents. You have your pack decker on top of it, the cardboard case trays that they go into. Then you have delivery drivers, other parts of the supply chain, and they just add up the cost. That direct to consumer, I'm just handing a can of beer to somebody and they're giving me $6.
Okay. Well, I've run out of time. For the record, Chair Lady, I just want you to know, I've had more beer spilt on me than I've ever drank. So, being a Baptist, I need to say that.
The
And you know the
gentleman,
difference between a Baptist and a Methodist, don't you, Chair Lady? A Baptist doesn't speak to you in the liquor store. So, thank you all very.
the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Chair Lady.
And the gentle lady from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. And I want to say thank you to both you and the ranking member for holding this incredibly important hearing today. As mentioned in various testimony, the reason for this domino effect on our food systems is really down to the tightly bound food supply chain, which is incredibly reliant on each step with little room for error. You know, I'm a member of both the House Ag and this committee, and I've seen firsthand during this pandemic how the food supply chain, from farmers to meat processors to grocery stores to fisheries to restaurants and more, has been greatly affected by this pandemic. I also am a co-founder of the Bipartisan Congressional Supply Chain Caucus. I've been working directly with leaders back in my district and here in DC to learn more about this domino effect. One industry that is a piece of the food supply chain, and that I know we have in all of our districts, are these local independent restaurants. The independent restaurant industry continues to suffer as more are forced to close their doors. And now in places like Minnesota, they're forced to figure out how they're going to stay afloat when they lose that outdoor seating. It's pretty cold in Minnesota, and it's impossible to sit outdoors in the winter. So I have two questions related to restaurants. The first for Ms. Gorton, and the second for Mr. LaRue. Mr. LaRue, it's great to see you. I'll get my questions out of the way, and then I'll ask each of you to answer those afterward. Ms. Gorton, you spoke about the trouble restaurants are in your testimony. Can you speak to how giving restaurants, as proposed by the updated HEROES Act, which contains $120 billion for payroll and other expenses, would help your business, restaurants, and the overall health of the food supply chain? And then second, Mr. LaRue, I've heard extensively from farmers in my district that programs to connect with local schools and restaurants would be beneficial. Obviously, I'm right there with Ms. Finkenauer with the Ramp Up Act. What programs do you think could be helpful to increase the pipeline of farm products to restaurants and to diversifying our food supply chains? So first, Ms. Gordon.
Thank you. The recently updated HEROES Act does a lot to address the plight of restaurants, allowing for more flexibility for the forgiveness of debt payments to us, their suppliers, and for forgivability of the cost of supplies. And so this certainly goes a long way towards sort of the reverse domino effect. If we can help the ultimate restaurants, that's going to flow back up the supply chain. It's going to unstick product from being backed up in the supply chain. It's going to allow us as suppliers to your constituents and their independent restaurants to continue to extend credit and provide food as they ramp up and try to fill up their pantries again. I might say, however, though, that while the independent restaurants are absolutely hurting, one of the things that's overlooked in this current bill are franchise restaurants. And I just want to make one comment about that. I think that there seems to be a misperception that the name on the outside of the restaurant that's associated with the chain means that there is money flowing into those restaurants from the franchisor. Many of the small franchisees are just like independent operators. They may have more than one location, but they too are suffering from the same problems created by the pandemic that smaller independent restaurants. So I would encourage Congress to include franchisees in any relief that is provided. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gordon. And Mr. LaRue.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, because it's always important to try to find those connections, right, from the the family farmers out there to the businesses themselves, and in this case, independent restaurants. There's a number of USDA programs that Congress included in the most recent Farm Bill, which I think is really helpful, and the more that we can do to kind of spur use of that. But, the LAMP program, which is Local Agriculture Market Program, really helps farmers out there build marketing plans, build connections out there that would include those restaurants. It also ties in with farmers markets as well, and also the local food promotion program. Those, along with the Farm to School grant program, collectively work to try to build these connections. So the more that we can do to kind of reinforce the access to these programs, I think will get us a long step toward building that resilience that you speak of.
Thank you so much, Mr. LaRue. And Madam Chairwoman, it appears I am out of time, so I will yield back.
Thank you. The gentle lady yields back. And thank you again to all our witnesses today for their testimony and for offering their views on the challenges facing America's food system and what America's small businesses need to recover from this historic, unprecedented crisis. By sharing your experiences, we will be able to better assist all small businesses in the difficult road ahead. Even though I'm proud of both the PPP and EIDL programs, we must continue to work to find other ways to assist our country's small food businesses, from restaurants and grocery stores to farms and processors, so that they and their workers can continue to ensure that the rest of us can have access to food, whether from a store, a restaurant, a farmer's market, or a food pantry. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered, and if there's no further business before this committee, we are adjourned.